Thanks, Stuart, for organizing this, this panel. So my perspective is going to be quite different from what you heard from Jay and Christina. I'm going to talk a little bit about recent research that's looked at the challenge. It's pretty hard to design public policy to encourage consumers or big fleets to switch to cleaner technology or cleaner vehicles. There's a couple of big challenges, a couple of important reasons why that's hard. And so I'm going to just talk about some recent research that looks at public policy that's been designed to try to encourage people to adopt cleaner, lower emissions or cleaner technologies. So the two big challenges, at least from an academic's point of view, and this is a very economics-based view of public policy here. The first challenge is identifying exactly who, designing a public policy that identifies or that targets the right people, right? So how do you know who the right people are? How do you know who the right people in the sense of the ones who might be the biggest emitters, the ones who are most closest to the margin of being persuaded to switch to a cleaner technology? How do you identify who those users are and then target them? That's the first problem. The second problem is solving the well-known network problem, which I think both Jay and Christina alluded to, which is how do you, in any technology where there's some kind of hardware or software, it's hard to convince consumers to adopt the hardware if the software is not in place, and it's hard to convince firms to supply software when the hardware is not in place. So this is not a new problem. We see this in media markets. We see this in all kinds of markets. The same is true in automobiles and in designing these technologies. So let me first talk about recent research that I've done with some colleagues, and I'll talk about a second paper very quickly that's on the second problem, the network problem. So the first piece of research was, how do we design public policy to encourage people to buy cleaner cars? There have been many programs in Canada and the US, both at the provincial level, the state level, federally, which have been designed to target people and convince them to adopt cleaner vehicles, hybrid cars, for example, or plug-in hybrids, and we're clearly seeing different technologies come in. So at different points in time, these incentives were in place at the federal level, and they're still in place in most Canadian provinces today, most, or at least many US states today. And I'm only going to focus on pure monetary tax incentives, and we're going to try to see what the incentives of what the results of these programs were. There's also non-monetary incentives, things like HOV, lane access, free parking, et cetera. Well, so the paper that I wrote with some colleagues at UBC, we compared Canadian provinces that offered these tax incentives, so essentially sales tax rebates to Canadian consumers to try to encourage them to buy hybrid cars. So there were the incentives that essentially relaxed or reduced sales taxes on these cars. And we compared provinces that had these programs. So BC is one of them, Ontario, Quebec, PEI, and one or two others as well. We compared these provinces with those that haven't had these programs. We've also compared provinces over time. So over time, BC has ramped up its program of offering tax rebates. So you might think that the program is more effective over time. We look at changes within provinces and across provinces. And we find that these programs do matter. They do have an effect. So provinces that offered these incentives to buy cleaner cars actually sold more cleaner cars. That's true. And provinces that increased their programs also sold more cleaner cars within province over time. So that's true as well. The question is how effective? How much does it matter? So we tried to estimate essentially what choices would people have made had these programs not been in place. So without going into the details, we had to do a pretty technical quantitative analysis, but we estimated, if you hadn't bought that Honda Civic Hybrid, what other car would you have bought? And we use hard data from before and after these programs to come up with the choices people would have made. And we used that information, or at least our estimates of that information, to calculate how much gasoline, and therefore effectively carbon dioxide, was saved by having these programs. So in particular, if people switched from car A to car B, and car B was cleaner, how much gasoline did the province and the world save from not having, from those people driving, well, not driving less, but consuming less carbon and emitting less carbon dioxide. So we try to calculate that. And then we try to, on the cost side, work out how expensive were these programs. So essentially just add up the total amount of the tax rebates that governments gave out, and therefore the tax revenue that was lost across all of these provinces and over time. And our average number was, across all Canadian provinces, across the last 7 or 8 years, it costs about $200 to offset each ton of carbon dioxide, which is a huge number. That's a really high number. That's almost an order of magnitude higher than the cost of offsetting carbon on, say, a climate exchange. So that's a very high cost. Now, we we recognize that these programs aren't only in place to encourage to reduce gasoline consumption today. There's effects over time, there's dynamic effects. We take that into account. We still find a pretty high cost for these programs. So the reason is, at least to us, quite intuitive. People, these programs do work, but they convince people on the margin to buy somewhat cleaner cars. So the person who buys a Honda Civic Hybrid because of this program would not have, in the alternative universe, would not have bought a big pickup truck. That person, instead of buying a Civic Hybrid, might have bought a Honda Civic, a regular car, in which case the difference in terms of gasoline consumption is quite small between those two cars. The regular Civic is pretty fuel efficient as it goes. So on the margin, you don't actually save all that much gasoline. That's one reason. The other reason is you also end up giving this tax rebate to people who would have bought this car anyway, right? So that was the first problem I alluded to. It's very hard to identify who the people are, who the people on the margin who might be convinced to change their minds are. And so because you cannot identify those people, you've got to give this tax rebate to everyone, and so it ends up being quite expensive. So that's the reason why we think that these programs are expensive. Real quick, I'm just going to describe a second piece of research, which again highlights this other challenge, this network problem challenge that I alluded to. So this is a recent research coming out of University of Toronto. The problem, as I described before, is very simple. How do you convince people to adopt a new technology when the required software, the required inputs for that technology aren't being supplied by firms? Firms aren't supplying that technology because consumers haven't yet adopted the hardware. So in this case, the question was, how do you convince people to buy or to convert to flex fuel vehicles? FFVs, which I'm sure everyone in this room, or most people here would know, are capable of running E85, or at least a blend of gasoline and ethanol, which can be as high as 85% ethanol. So it is a cleaner fuel. It's also cheaper, although it's cheaper for a reason. There's massive subsidies, which is why ethanol is cheaper. It's not intrinsically cheaper, but let's leave that aside. How do you convince people to adopt these, to buy these cars, or to fit their cars with these converters, especially when fueling stations, gas stations don't generally sell E85? So that's the classic network problem. And in fact, I just described that. Gas stations won't sell E85 if consumers don't have FFVs. Consumers won't buy FFVs unless gas stations sell E85. How do you solve this problem? Well, it's actually pretty hard. In this particular case, states in the US, 6 big Midwestern states, just imposed mandates that said that all government fleets have to be outfitted with these converters that make them FFVs. That's a large enough number of vehicles that gas stations started selling E85, and so as a result, you're seeing more and more consumers now buy or outfit their vehicles with these converters. The bottom line here is that there's always going to be challenges trying to convince people to adopt a new technology, either because you don't know who the right people are to target, or because you have this classic chicken and egg problem. How do you get people to buy one technology when the other one isn't in place? So I'm just going to say a little bit on the topic at hand, which is plug-in conversions. Is there any reason to believe that this technology would work better? Well, there's, at least from a public policy point of view, is there an argument to be made that the government should maybe subsidize programs like this? So the advantage with plug-in conversions, aftermarket conversions, is there's one big advantage, which is that you will end up targeting people who do drive more or who emit more. So in other words, someone who doesn't drive a whole lot or someone who drives a relatively fuel-efficient car might not go out and adopt this technology. The one who drives a big gas guzzler, who drives a lot, has more of an incentive to adopt this technology. So that's getting around the first problem I described, which is how do you target the right people? This policy directly ends up targeting the right people, as opposed to the tax rebate case, where often the wrong people are targeted. So then that brings us to a second question. I'm not saying that this question is on the table. I'm just, it's just a hypothesis. Should we therefore subsidize technologies like this? Well, yes, to the extent that subsidizing them might increase the installed base of people who have this technology and might drive the cost down in the future. If that's the case, we should, although we'd need to do more research to actually establish that is the case. It's not automatic. The one point I'd like to make here, you may or may not agree, but in the economics discipline, certainly people believe that, look, there's a first best way to reduce carbon consumption. If the problem is carbon, we need to tax carbon more. All of the other methods are roundabout ways to get people to buy certain cars or to adopt aftermarket technologies, et cetera. If the real problem is carbon, the price of carbon needs to rise. Now, we also recognize that this is not easy, it's not politically feasible. in fact, BC is the one jurisdiction in North America, in fact, the first one that's actually implemented the carbon tax, and it's not been easy. So, this is more of a hypothetical case, but we should recognize, though, that all of these other incentives or subsidies or other government public policy programs are at best going to be, they're never going to be as efficient as a direct tax on carbon. So they're always going to be more blunt because because of the problems that I described. So I think, yes, that's the end of my presentation. So thanks, dear.